Thank you so much for joining the National Civic League's February webinar, Can Racial Equity Commissions Heal Communities? My name is Rebecca Trout, and I am the Program Director of the All-America City Awards and Communications here at the National Civic League. For those of you less familiar with the League, we are a 128-year-old nonprofit, and we aim to advance civic engagement to create more equitable and thriving communities. The All-America City Award is our flagship program. It began in 1949, and its aim is to recognize outstanding examples of local civic engagement and civic participation. We celebrate, recognize, and lift up those communities through our annual award program. And then we use this webinar series as well as some of our other publications to really share their best practices, as well as other tools and ideas that we think could help a community with their engagement practices. Before I dive into today's topic, I just want to give a quick shout out for the All-America City Award program. You are seeing on your screen the 2022 winners. These communities were recognized for using housing as a platform to really improve the prospects for early school success and equitable learning recovery. This will be one of the last times you see them on your screen during a webinar, that is, at least, because we are in the process of naming our 2023 finalists. So I'm excited that we are about to name another group of participants for 2023. Speaking of 2023, we are focused on really creating thriving communities through youth engagement. So communities will be applying based on projects and resources that help youth to really thrive in their communities and get involved in local decision-making processes. As you can see, the applications have already been due, and we are in the process with our review committee of taking a look at those applications, scoring them, and we'll be announcing this year's 20 finalists a little bit later in March. But for today, I'm really excited to be joined by 4 wonderful speakers that are going to be talking to us a little bit about racial equity commissions. We are joined by 2 of our senior fellows, Dante James and Larry Schooler. They're going to be talking about kind of the overall concepts, the structure and benefits to these commissions. And then we will be hearing from Steve and Darlene, who were actually participants in the Salt Lake City Racial Equity and Policing Commission. They're going to talk a little bit about that process, their experience participating in that, and some of the ongoing work and next steps of that commission. Before I hand it off to their capable hands, just a few housekeeping items. You'll notice that we are recording. The recording, as well as the slides and any external resources that the presenters share, will be emailed to you tomorrow. You will notice that everyone is on mute. We ask that you remain that way until the end, when we'll do a little bit of Q&A, and you can either drop your questions in the chat, or we'll have the ability to use the raise hand feature and unmute you, and you can ask your questions directly. So that is all from me. Now I'm going to hand it off to Larry Schooler, who's going to get us started. Larry?
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I hope everybody can hear me okay. Maybe a thumbs up if that's true. Wonderful to be spending another afternoon with National Civic League and with colleagues like Dante James and old friends like Steve Angeweirden and Darlene McDonald, or as I called them, Commissioner Angeweirden and Commissioner McDonald, when I was fortunate enough to team with them on the Racial Equity in Policing Commission in Salt Lake City, Utah. And we'll be hearing more about that here in just a moment. I want to start by, first of all, making sure you can see slides, which I am assuming is the case, and ask you to do some work for me here by putting something into the chat window if you can. When you hear either the phrase truth and reconciliation, or when you hear just the word reconciliation, what comes to mind? What are some of the ways that you relate to either that phrase or that word? I think it's one of these phrases and words that has been used across a lot of different domains to mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And so I think it's helpful as we share a paradigm with you today that we hear from you a little bit more about the way it resonates with you. So I see some great responses: repair, healing harm, making whole, Bridging a Gap, South Africa and Mandela, Healing, policy changes that lead to racial healing, Finding Common Ground, Justice, Healing and Repair, Restore, Coming Together to Reconcile Differences, Mediation, Accountability. Really terrific responses that I think a wide range of efforts. Tara Carmian, who I know from when we worked together in Travis County, also wrote Recurring Work, which I think is a really important point to think about this as less of an episodic effort and more of something that we should be thinking about on an ongoing basis. I had the good fortune to write a PhD dissertation and have a book about efforts at Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in North America, including examples in Greensboro, North Carolina, the state of Maine, and a national level effort in Canada. And I'm also privileged to be working with some groups, including Salt Lake City, that we worked with a couple of years ago, and a group in the Midwest and elsewhere on similar processes. And so I just want to set a framework for us to use today to talk about how this can be applicable to some of the work that I know interests a lot of us in the United States as we speak. We are not exclusively talking about this in the context of race, nor are we talking about it exclusively in the context of public safety or law enforcement. But I think it's proven to be a very effective way to approach conversations that involve understanding the past experiences, lived experiences of the people we are trying to engage, and looking for ways to rectify or repair relationships that may have been frayed or even never formed in the first place, still unformed between some communities and some law enforcement agencies. Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, which, as many of you pointed out, gained global fame in South Africa, but have existed in some 40 countries, as well as a number of examples in the United States and North America, are a way for a broad population to be heard. They're often contrasted with the idea of a court case, a class action, for example, where only certain people are called to testify. In Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, and in processes like that, the focus is on giving anyone who would like to be heard a chance, either in a public forum, in private, or even anonymously, and most importantly, without being subpoenaed or even necessarily invited, although certainly an invitation is extended to a wide audience. The goal is to get as many people involved in a particular issue to come forward and share without fear of reprisal. Now, obviously, when anyone speaks in a public forum, someone may try to refute what it is that they're saying. But in a typical truth and reconciliation process, we are taking it as a stipulation, as a given, that someone's truth is someone's truth. And in fact, multiple truths can even exist in tension. So in the context of policing, one of the things that we learned was that an officer could hold fast to the truth that she or he does their job as a law enforcement official without prejudice, without racial bias. And then a member of that community where that law enforcement officer serves can feel just as strongly that the department in which that person serves is truly racially prejudiced or racially biased. And we have to feel comfortable holding those two truths in tension. But we also create opportunities for new understanding and a creation of a different path, and less of a punitive measure and more of a productive measure, more of an effort to design a way to either repair or to restore or to in some way reconnect people that ought to be well connected, including communities and law enforcement agencies. And so there are a number of different ways that we can engage people in some of these conversations, including asking them when they feel safe or unsafe, when they feel protected or unprotected. For an officer, when did they feel like they did their job well, and maybe an occasion where they felt like they didn't do it as well. And it's important that we acknowledge that whether this be law enforcement or a municipality, maybe it could be a planning department dealing with some issues of redlining, or an agency charged with affordable housing dealing with concerns over gentrification or what have you. In all cases, there may be members of our communities who are coming forward with truths that feel dated, that feel like they are of a past era. but they feel very present to the people who are sharing them. And we have to be connected to that lived experience, no matter how many years back it may go, because for that person, before they can give us any input, before they can think about any problem solving, they need to feel heard. And I often talk about this in terms of checking baggage. I don't mean to be pejorative, but when we check our luggage on a flight or a train ride or a bus ride, what we're basically saying is this is something that's really important to me, but I'm willing to put it aside and not see it for the period of our flight or our trip, so as to ensure a safe passage. But I am going to take it back when I get to my destination. So too, I think with the stories that we tell in these difficult conversations, we're not dismissing them, we're not forgetting them, but we're also not necessarily going to let them affect every aspect of our participation in the dialogue. But if we don't share them, if we don't check those in, we won't be able to participate at all. We'll be too weighed down by them. They may not care whether their experience is representative of anybody other than themselves. And even if their good experiences with a particular institution or organization like police outnumber the bad may get a disproportionate amount of attention. Similarly, a law enforcement agency might say, why are we being judged on what they consider to be a bad apple? And how can we do our jobs if we are exposed to such scrutiny? The reality is obviously somewhere in the middle of all that, which is to say that we can't ignore the significance that our communities now place on oversight of law enforcement, for example, but we also want to give the police departments, the law enforcement agencies, enough space to say, we've revised our policy, we have updated our culture, and we think we have a meaningful path forward, but we want you to keep an eye on us as we go. So just real briefly, as we get into a conversation about this particular case, I wanted to share how this often takes form in the form of some sort of stakeholder body, some sort of advisory body. It can be a task force, it can be a commission. It's critical that diversity be a part of the formation of that body, and not just racial diversity. Racial diversity is critical, but so is country of origin, so is gender identity, sexual orientation, so is ability or differently abled, so is housed or unhoused, if that's possible. There are all different ways, socioeconomic, geographic, that we can think about diversity in this context. And then, of course, we want an inclusive group, those who may be thinking about a radical approach like defunding or totally decommissioning a law enforcement agency, others who have direct hands-on experience with what we're talking about, be it law enforcement or otherwise, those who have had direct experience interacting with whatever agency we're talking about, both positive and negative. And young adults, even pre-voting age and pre-tax-paying age, are just as important a voice as the adults in this case. The desire is for us to, instead of just deciding things by majority vote in a setting like this, be looking for opportunities for consensus, where we only make recommendations that everyone in the group feels that they can support. Now, oftentimes that gets commingled with unanimity, and we know how difficult and elusive that can be in our country. But as Steve, as Commissioner Angel Weirden, as Commissioner McDonald can tell you, we discovered consensus on many different fronts as we looked at racial equity and policing in Salt Lake City. And perhaps even more important than all of that is the need for robust, multi-platform, multi-opportunity ways for the public to engage. We need to allow them to come to meetings and speak, but we also need to make an extra effort to meet people where they are through organizations that they support, through their telephones, through text messaging, through online. But I think most importantly, going to where those people are, both in virtual and in physical space. And this is just a list of some of the stakeholders that could be involved. And from this point on, I'm going to yield over to Dante James and to our commissioners to give you a little bit more insight into this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you. Thank you. I think you teed it up well. I'm just going to mostly hit kind of bullet points if I can, just so I really want to leave space for the two commissioners who sat on a commission, as well as your questions and answers, your Q&A anyway. So just to address the question of this session, can racial equity commissions heal community? My answer is no. it takes a lot more than a commission to heal communities. And so what all does that entail? Certainly these come as a result, as Larry said, of sometimes court cases from the Department of Justice, and you get consent decrees, you get settlement agreements. But most all come as a result of some police misconduct that has harmed the communities. And as Frederick Douglass said, I mean, power yields nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. I'm not aware of, and please put in the chat if I'm wrong, one that has been created without some reason for its creation in terms of police misconduct and community protest, whatever you want to call that. And so what are the goals essentially? A number of things. One, most specifically, is accountability. You know, you'll see a lot of work on policies, on training, on other things like that, which are all absolutely important components of this. But if you don't have accountability, you can create policies all day and it mean nothing. And so until community sees and feels something differently being done and a different result, you're not going to get any reconciliation, if you will, because communities are the ones who are feeling the results of whatever it is that police are engaging in. On some level, you also want, communities want culture change. That's a big picture question. What is culture change? And you will often, I have personally often heard police chiefs around the country or officers say, you know, that happens over there, that doesn't happen in our community. But they never have, I won't say never, but many have never really heard from community members to know the answer to that question. So, and you also can't have these commissions without police sitting on them.
Is there nuts?
Because, I mean, if equity requires you to involve the most impacted in the decision-making process, that's community and police. You can't put something together, put a policies, put a program together, and then hand it off to the police and say, now implement it. It's not going to work. And not just command staff, but line officers, because they're the ones on the street every day. And so how are you ensuring that there's a variety, as Larry said, diversity on that commission, not just command staff, but also line officers? What are some of the benefits or the results desired? Again, accountability. Being able to see different results because folks are being held accountable and the expectations are very clear. Differences in training, I mean, you can run through the de-escalation training, implicit bias training, all those things. But for me, it's also about how do you involve the community in the processes? Who from the community is at the academy? Who from the community is working on in-service, those ongoing continuing education that the officers will go through? And what are those? You know, they need to be more than, you know, how you engage in a traffic stop and, you know, how you find cover when you're in a shooting situation. But what are the community engagement components to the training, and is community involved in that process? Even to the point of sitting on the panels and deciding who is being hired, because you get a very different perspective than if it's just police officers sitting on the evaluation panels to determine who's going to move forward in the process. Essentially, what you, I think, want overall is increased trust from all communities. You know, we can talk about communities of color all day, but all communities, right? But it's also, in the work that I do, the definition of equity is simply this, that equity is achieved when one's identity cannot predict the outcome. And that can be expanded to communities, when the community's identity cannot predict the outcome. And that's not what we see right now. Communities can predict what the outcome is going to be, how they're going to be policed. And so you can increase trust, you can also decrease trust in this process. Looking at consent decrees, I mean, Oakland had one for 20 years. It just ended last year. Portland's has been going on for 10 years. So, you know, after 20 years, why is the community going to believe that the police are really trying to do something differently and change themselves? So all of those things come into play as you're engaging in this process. But you have to have community, you have to have police, and you have to have accountability. If you don't have one of those legs, it will fall apart. So I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to Commissioner Weirden or Commissioner McDonald for their experiences and expertise. So thank you.
I can go first. Thank you very much, Dante and Larry. I'm going to start off by first making a disclaimer. We're having a little bit of high wind in my area, and it knocked our internet out. So if for some reason I lose connection again, Steve, jump in, if you will. So I want to speak to my experience on the racial equity in policing commission in Salt Lake City. I was asked by the mayor to be one of the community leaders to join the commission. I was very honored to do so. It came on the heel of the murder of Mr. George Floyd, as well as Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, and Miss Breonna Taylor. And before that, as many of us know, there were many others who I don't have the time to name, that is just culminated into what I call the summer of 2020. And I think many of us will remember where they were and what they were doing during that time. And the emotions and the feelings of the community were very high. And to be quite honest, there was not a lot of trust between the members of the community, law enforcement, or even I would say city leaders, as to how we move forward with racial reckoning, in a sense, or as Larry said, that truth and reconciliation, which I wrote down when you asked that question, is the first step towards healing. And there's a phrase about open wounds, right? Open wounds do not heal. You have to do something in order to begin that healing process. And even if it's just wrapping that wound so that it does not set up an infection, that is what we had to do. And it's a continuation. And I know I said that in a past tense, but it really isn't a past tense situation. Those are things that we must do, that first step. And then it involved myself as Mr. I hate this, I never get his name right, Commissioner Steve, to come together with members of law enforcement. Now, for some of the people that were part of this commission, this could have been the very first time that they actually had an engagement with members of law enforcement. And in these types of situations, trust is earned. It is not guaranteed, it is earned. And when you have members of law enforcement and you have a very hurting community that is coming together, and during that time, it was right in the middle of COVID. So we couldn't even come together in the same room. We were meeting in spaces like this, and being able to start the dialogue. And for me, that process at least helped break down some of the barriers that were there that prevented us from reaching out and communicating with people we would normally not do that with, and that is members of law enforcement. So as I was saying, the trust had to be built up and that dialogue had to start. And I remember sharing stories with members of law enforcement regarding my own experience as a woman, and particularly as a woman of color. And as a woman of color, I live in Utah, as a woman of color in the state of Utah that is overwhelmingly white, being racially profiled, being asked certain questions, and how those questions were phrased and how they made me feel. That was the first time many members of law enforcement ever heard how certain questions that they asked could make community members feel. And it got them to think maybe there's a way that we can rephrase the questions that we are asking. So that process was very helpful, in my opinion, to be able to begin the process of healing and kind of wrap some of those wounds. My individual perspective on this is that this process is very necessary. I believe that the racial equity commissions are necessary. And if cities or states or communities are able to invest in this type of service, it will help steer them, I believe, in the correct direction. I learned so much from Dr. Larry and Dante. I learned a lot. They help facilitate many of our conversations and really got us to think about things in ways that we may not have thought about previously. One of the very first meetings that we had, and I'm going to try to say this without getting overly emotional about it. I remember when the very first meeting, Dante showed up with a video. And the video talks about the history of policing. And for me, I like to call myself an amateur historian. That really hit home for me because there's a lack of understanding of how policing in communities even got started. And when Dante showed up, the very first meeting with that video, it was, thank you. Someone understood how we got here and was sharing it with people who may not have ever known how it all began. And once you know the history, you can begin to at least start taking those steps, because we now know how we got here, how we move forward. You can't do that if you don't know your past, if you don't know your history. As they say, we learn our history so that we don't repeat those mistakes of the past. So I really appreciate it. Having the type of facilitators that understood the mission, and they understood the mission, and we could not have made the progress that we made as a commission, really working to do the work and was committed to do the work. And we were fortunate enough, I'm just going to say it, to have a Mayor Mendenhall in Salt Lake City, who was also committed to do that work because she didn't have to. It was a choice, a commitment that she made, and to recognize that there are members of her community that's hurting. And being able to reach out to that community and say, what can I do as the mayor of this city to help move us forward as a community, as a city, as a people? And that was the step that she chose to take. So I personally believe having a racial equity commission for cities and communities is a step towards that truth and reconciliation process of healing. Where we are right now, I am actively today working on the backlash, really, of the 2022, the summer of 2022, by many of the bills that state legislators are putting forth to unravel and undo a lot of the racial equity work that we have been doing for years. And I know there are people who have been doing this work longer than myself. I'm going to consider myself a newbie at this work. There are people who have been doing this work for decades. And a lot of the gains that we have made or that have been made towards racial reconciliation, towards diversity, equity, and inclusion, some of that is being unraveled by state legislators, including here in Utah. And being able to show up to talk about some of the successes that we've had as a city and as a commission, to be able to speak to how we begin the process of healing, why this diversity and equity commissions are important for that. And having people just show up and just speak to that. That's all they have to speak to, because there's a lot of disinformation about what diversity, equity, inclusion is. And I know that towards the end of our time with Dante and Larry, they started to feel some of that as well, where many of these states and cities started to roll back because of that disinformation. So you have to speak up and speak out when it occurs, because it does trickle down and have an impact on the work that you are trying to do, so that we don't have a repeat of the summer of 2020. And when I think about the work that we've done in the commission, when I think about showing up at the Capitol and saying, okay, this is what we're doing, this is what we need to do, this is where we're at, I feel that the work that we have done and the work that has been done before us by the ancestors and the leaders before us in the civil rights movement, it is incumbent upon us to not drop the ball. And I felt the heavy weight of not dropping the ball. The ball had been given to us. We saw what happened in 2020, and now we have this ball in our hand, and we have to make it, I hate to use a football analogy, but we have to make it into that end zone, because if we drop the ball again, we will be right back here. And I felt we can't drop this ball. We cannot have our children and our grandchildren doing the same thing, trying to get to the same place where we are right now. We have got to be able to move to that, up to the next, I don't know, first down. Okay, football analogy. We gotta get there. And so with the racial equity and policing commissions that we were on, I think that these are the steps that must be taken by cities. It is important. They are important, as not only just for racial equity and inclusion, but also for disabilities. Those disabilities that are seen and unseen. We forget that not all disabilities are seen. And many of our law enforcement, Mr. Steve will probably speak to this. When law enforcement are called, many of them are called on mental health cases, and that end up going very, very wrong. And then we have the news flash of something that went very, very wrong. And being able to work with law enforcement and to make recommendations on how to recognize those things and how to mitigate those, and to recognize and to make recommendations on hiring practices surrounding that. We would not have been able to get there at all without the help of our facilitators, Dante James and Larry Schooler, because for me, I'm new to this work, right? So they helped us form the words and sentences that were necessary to be able to make the gains and recommendations that we were able to make to the city, so that we can do better as a city and as a community. Our next steps really is to continue. You get tired. You get tired. I'm not even gonna lie, you get tired. And sometimes you just say, I'm gonna sit this one out. We can't. That's just the bottom line, we can't. It is a continuous work in progress. And it's incumbent upon all of us to stay in the game, because that's the only way, as a people, as a country, as a community, that we don't pass this on to our children and our grandchildren. I'm going to say grandchildren now because I'm a grandmother now. That's the only way that we can get there. And so we just got to keep going. And that's what I feel is the next step. But I'm going to hand it over to Steve now.
Darlene, you're fabulous. Thank you so much. Now I'm starting with goosebumps before I get to start my my presentation. So just as a reminder, my work background has been in law enforcement. I worked here for the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office and then Unified Police Department for just over 25 years. And I've been retired for just about 5 years now. And my role, one of my roles on this commission, certainly was as a community member, but also with that law enforcement perspective and having those conversations. But the first thing, you know, to acknowledge is while I'm supportive of law enforcement, we can do better, and we've done wrong, right? And we absolutely have to acknowledge that and look for those opportunities to move forward. As I look through my notes, I think I'm going to be a little redundant on what's already been said, but hopefully add just a little angle to that and a little different perspective. But what I was asked to do was speak about our process here on the Racial Equity Commission in Salt Lake City. My personal perspective, some recommendations I have, and then some next steps. Listening to Dante and Larry again, I'm reminded of how fabulous having professional facilitators has been to get our commission off on the right track. And to me, that's part of the leadership in the process, is having those right folks at the top to help get this established and move forward. I also want to give a shout out to Mayor Mendenhall, the mayor here in Salt Lake City, for having the courage between her and the council to start a commission like this in the middle of that chaotic time that Darlene was talking about back in 2020, and set the ground rules that the outcomes should be a better, stronger police department with closer ties to our community. So I think it's very courageous to start that. We also have strong leadership and support from our police department, who acknowledged up front that they thought they were doing pretty well with the community until people were rioting in the streets. And I think it's pretty courageous to acknowledge that and understand that we need to learn, or law enforcement needs to learn, and we need to do better. And then that leadership group also comes from the community leaders, like you just heard Darlene. I'm not a very formal person, but I want to give you all the respect in the world, Darlene, for your role on this commission and the work you do in our community. And like so many others that came together on that commission to work together to improve our police department and improve our outcomes. Couple of pieces about the process that really struck me were, one, trying to manage our community expectations. There was such a range of desires, everything from defunding to why are you even messing with the police department, that we really had to set expectations about what we were trying to do. And I think most of the people on this call are affiliated with local government, and policy change is slow and it's difficult work, and you don't get those instant results. So we have to manage those expectations about what we're trying to accomplish and how we're going to get there. And I think that way it maintains the legitimacy of the commission, because some people just want instant answers, but that's not always how it's going to be. And particularly as a recommendation making body to the mayor and the council to create ordinance, that takes time, and we have to respect that. The other thing that I feel pretty strongly about is the stability of the commission, right? So we're now in ordinance in Salt Lake City, so hopefully we will be maintained through in perpetuity for this kind of work, because some of the things that Darlene was talking about that I think we all see across the country, both locally and nationally, is that pendulum does move back and forth, and we have different laws made and we make progress, and then we feel like we're taking a step back, and but it's the maintenance, it's the longevity that I think are critical. And I think if we can set those standards and we can just hold on to the premise that we're trying to create a police department that provides service, safety, that's public safety, but it's also that feeling of safety when you interact with officers, because that can be defined so broadly. Inclusion and improving quality of life, and then we're bringing legitimacy to law enforcement, then we're moving in the right direction. So as a individual perspective, again, as a law enforcement member, I do support law enforcement, but I do also understand that we need to do better. And as Dante beautifully articulated, one of the reasons we're here is because of misconduct. And that's not on the part of every officer, but all of our institutions need to be improved to provide service to all segments of our community. And if we're not also looking at that and how we're going to meet the needs of those, it can even be difficult to provide services, but we need to understand that our community includes everybody. And that's race and mental health, it's, you know, housing situations, it's all of those things. And we need our department to understand that it's not just a few bad apples that we're talking about, right? I think Larry used that example. It's not just those few bad apples, it's about all of us. And I would try to talk to our officers when they would say, look, if we could just teach the community what we do, they would understand. I said, that's not quite right. There are some things that education could close that gap, and that is important. But just because you're out there with good intentions and you're working hard to meet our community needs doesn't mean that we're going to be successful, right? Because one thing that law enforcement is not very good at is including the community in defining the kind of work that we're going to do. So to those officers, thank you for your service, I would say, but also understand that there's a perspective the community has about how you're doing that and what you represent. And we need to come together and have conversations about those things so we can move forward, so we can have that accountability that Dante was referencing, and we can continue to build those relationships. So as a former law enforcement officer, I could talk to law enforcement, and maybe not everyone on either the commission, quite frankly, or on the law enforcement side fully agreed with me, but they couldn't tell me that I didn't know, because I've also done that job in a very similar circumstance, right? And we need to be able to have a bridge to be able to have those conversations. I took my role on the commission very seriously because I've always recognized there's a gap, and we need to be able to help bridge that gap and help fill in those spaces. So the recommendations I have are kind of complemented, but by what Dante said about the accountability and the training and the use of force and all of those things. But there has to be legitimacy to all of these. So I definitely agree on creating policy, use of force, oversight, you know, body cams, mandatory reporting. But I also know that there has to be a way that our community can actually believe that law enforcement is going to do that, right? So what's the check in that? What's the inspection in that? But I wanted to focus on the element that we've done on the commission, which is trying to create that culture change, right? So Reverend Davis, who is just one of the most amazing community leaders, civil rights leader that is probably in the world, but certainly in our community, would talk about creating the department that we want to have. Let's not settle for what we currently have. Let's develop policy and processes for the one that we want. And there were a lot of officers who separated from the department. If you're gonna do these oversight things, I don't even want to work there. And it's hard to do your job in law enforcement without having enough bodies there to do it, without having enough humans actually out there doing it. But if you want to quit because you don't want to be accountable, that's really okay with me. right? Let's make sure that we have the right people doing the right job for the right reasons. And if you're going to self-separate, let's create a process where we bring people in who want to do the job with the way that we expect. And so those hiring processes and those retention process and promotion processes are incredibly critical. And then in that training area, and these are all areas we made recommendation here in Salt Lake City. In that training area, what are our new recruits learning in the academy, and what does our FTO, our field training program, look like, and how diverse is it as we take these young impressionable recruits and we put them out on the street, where they're going to be overwhelmed by what's happening in the community, but also learning the culture of the department. Let's make sure they're with the right people to give them the best start to get that outcome that we want for the department that we want to have. And then I guess I'll just generally refer to them as progressive practices. Darlene talked about the challenges with mental health in our community, and it's a very real thing. And we felt like addressing a co-response model where we have social workers and law enforcement working together was such an area of critical importance that we even asked the department to prioritize those detectives, even though we know you're short on the street, because that connection is so critical. There's real disproportionalities in access to mental health by our communities of color. And if you have untreated mental health coupled with a lack of trust for law enforcement in a crisis situation, we can see that there's going to be bad outcomes that comes with that, right? And I think Darlene, that's what you were talking about. And so we absolutely pushed for supporting that co-response model, and now a civilian response model, right? So why do we have a tool like a sworn officer going to recover a stolen bike or pick up a hypodermic needle in the park or something like that? We can have people that can do that and give that the right attention, but we don't have to go with such a big tool. So next steps on our commission, we're just coming through, I think, our third year now, and my term's expiring, and it's been a real privilege to serve. But one thing I'm looking at is the turnover, right? Because there's so much history and so much understanding and process that the new folks coming in aren't aware of. And I think giving the history of our commission and the process and our role and the things that we're trying to accomplish doesn't mean they can't change it if they don't want to. That's what fresh blood is all about, right? But know where we're coming from and know where the thoughts are. And there were some lessons learned along the way that maybe we can share with you to have this continue to be robust. Second recommendation and in next steps I have is, let's continue to look at the work that we've already done and start to measure our outcomes and see if we're achieving those culture change, right? Because if there's not that sustained follow-up for these recommendations, I think, being a veteran government employee, I know that we look at flavor of the month and we try to outlast things, and we know that some other idea is going to come along, but we have to have that integrity in that process. I think we're making good recommendations, and I think they're worth following up on and making sure that accountability is there and that we're following through with the successful programs and making the adjustments that we need to if we don't. And then the third is we need to just keep looking for ways that we can do better. I feel like any institution who's not being critical of themselves and looking for ways to improve is already in trouble, right? We have to continue that effort to examine what we're doing, making sure that we're meeting the needs, and there's so much EDI work that's being done around this country. I think that's a great example of where we had not really looked before, but now we can see how we can improve our systems. So my last couple of months on the commission, trying to get support behind looking at that first line leadership. There's sergeants here in Salt Lake, and we look at some of the flaws that resulted in just absolutely abysmal outcome with that specialty Scorpion unit in Memphis. Those high-speed units who are the specialized officers who are going to solve the community's problem, they need to be watched extremely closely and even consider whether or not that's an appropriate use of law enforcement. But all of our specialty units, our SWAT teams, our K9 units, all our warrant squads, our gang units, these need such clear expectations and such clear oversight, and particularly from first line leaders who can hold those officers accountable for their actions and make clear that when you're out operating in those very difficult environments, that we're doing the right things for the right reasons. And I think that is the next area I think that we need to look at, not because there's defined problems, but because we don't want to wait for that, right? Let's make sure that we're doing the best that we can. And I just think that's an example of how we keep digging into all the areas that we can continue to do better in law enforcement. So I think that's what I have to say. I do absolutely support the concept of these commissions, because I think it's a great intersection with government and law enforcement and our police department. And I think it's a great way to have those good conversations. I think we can yield some good results. So anyway, thank you for your time.
If I may, there have been a number of questions popping in the chat that are excellent, and fortunately, Dante and I, and I'm sure Steve and Darlene could and have been able to answer some of them. That doesn't mean that we don't want to hear others, but I do want to flag that there have been some great questions and that we've been trying to answer them. I did briefly want to share a clip from the Salt Lake City work that I think illustrates the power of public engagement. And I know that this session is meant to go just to the top of the hour, but at least one or two of us can stay longer if there are those who would like to ask additional questions. But this is taken from a televised town hall meeting that we conducted in 4 different languages, where we not only allowed people to call in, but we also called out to certain communities and we allowed for text messaging. But what you're about to hear is a caller sharing their sentiments right towards the end of this telecast. Ordinary perspectives that we've been able to hear. I have a caller who didn't give us a name. This will be our last call of the evening. So caller, if you're there, please go ahead.
Just a few examples.
Hi, I was calling and I'm in and out of another meeting, but my question was going to be about diversity training. How often are the police having that diversity training? So I am a Pacific Islander, and so one of the things that happened in our culture, it's a situation that has happened before, where to look a person in the eyes can be disrespectful. So for police officers wanting to speak to a Pacific Islander young man, and that's the other thing, is I have boys, and if they get pulled over, they look older than their age. And so if a police officer pulls them over, asks them their age, and because they appear to be older, they're treated differently. So my question is how often is diversity training being done within the academy and once they leave there while they're in the workforce? And what does that look like? Who's over that? I mean, all the details of that. Because there's been several times of racial profiling. With my own experience as well.
I'm so glad that you were able to stick around and give us that incredibly helpful comment. That is, so I'll leave it there. But that to me is in some ways the is a great distillation of what value this commission added. Only when you had a commission like the one that we had in Salt Lake City, with commissioners like Commissioner Angel Weirden and Commissioner McDonald, who could draw from both lived and worked experience and who could understand and relate to the needs of a broad cross-section of residents, could some of those critical observations come forward. I mean, something so basic as eye contact, which can be a highly provocative kind of issue in a law enforcement interaction, for that to surface was, in my mind, extremely meaningful. So I noticed a comment from Marcus Harris that I wanted to call to Commissioner Angel Weirden's attention, that he focused on the service component, a commitment to understanding the shared truth. Law enforcement officers can serve communities honorably and at the same time be a source of a community's pain. Only through an understanding of shared truth can we begin to find lasting solutions. There was also a question asked by my colleague Benita Duran a little ways up in the chat. I wanted to see if Commissioner McDonald or Angel Weirden wanted to speak to it. She asked about addressing issues and dynamics of religion and the church, curious about what it's like for adults of color of different religions. I assume by capitalizing the and the church, we're talking about the Latter-day Saints, Mormon Church. But commissioners, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that, but I do encourage others with questions to keep posting them in the chat. We can do our best to continue answering them.
I'm just going to speak briefly to that. For me, it's not so much an issue in respect with law enforcement. It's more or less a cultural issue. And we have been addressing this on a broader sense, if that makes sense. It is, we're having right now, we're having an issue with DEI, right? But this is happening all over the country where there is an attack on DEI. And making people understand what diversity, equity, and inclusion is and is not. It's not just about the dominant religion of this particular state. This is happening all over the country. So it's just an education and being very diligent and showing up with that and just speaking up about what diversity, equity, inclusion is, who is harmed when we don't have it, and try to dispel all of the disinformation out there about diversity, equity, inclusion. I don't know if Steve, if you have anything further to add to that.
Not really. I know as a commission, we did also include a variety of different religions with the understanding, I think it was Reverend Davis, who said we're all in one big canoe, and if it goes down on one end, I mean, you may go up on the other end, but in the end, it's all going to sink. So we just need to find a way that we're going to work together. Can be a challenge with the dominant paradigm because that's what people are accustomed to. But I think we work through that in the same way that we talk about. We just meet people where they are and try to have those conversations.
Just so that everybody can benefit from some of these great questions, I'll mention a couple that were listed above, including what kind of staff support did the commission have and budget. We were blessed to work with the person who became the city's first chief equity officer, Coletta Lynch, who sort of commandeered a number of other staff people who were at different times supportive of the project. There also, I think, was some compensation given to commissioners themselves as a reflection of how much time and effort this work took. And I know that advisory boards, citizen advisory boards, often are staffed or peopled by volunteers. And I think that there is a reflection that in order for all folks to feel able to participate, that kind of thing is important. There was some question about other models. I mentioned Greensboro, Maine, and Canada. Alachua County, where Gainesville, Florida is certainly a noteworthy example as well. There was some question about language justice, and as I alluded to just then, we didn't just interpret in Spanish because we were conscious of the fact that languages beyond just Spanish, like Vietnamese, if I remember correctly, and Arabic, are significant in the Salt Lake City community and to the people who were participating. So we had a lot of mix of languages provided with real-time interpretation. And then there's a question about measures of success that both Jessica Estevez and Brianna Evans asked. And I and Dante gave some response to that, but if Commissioner Angel-Weirden wanted to chime in on that question, that might be meaningful. How you measure the success of the work of the commission.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that it exists, and we have these conversations, and our police departments at the table are good indicators of some early success. I was trying to think through, I believe over the last 2 years, we gave about 40 recommendations that were approved by the mayor and the council for the police department. And I think they've implemented about 30 of those. But I'm just going to say that's another sign of success, assuming that we guessed correctly on what needed to be changed. And just going to go back to that measuring piece. So I think the jury is still out on some of the effectiveness of that outcome. And I think we'd still like to look at use of force and community complaints and some other areas where we could try to quantify that. But I'm very optimistic about the direction we're going, but results might be a little too early for me to try to comment too much more.
One additional resource, thank you very much, Steve. One additional resource I just want to provide, and hopefully we'll get this passed on as a link to that full hour-and-a-half or so town hall that we were able to conduct. There were more than 1,000 people that joined, and I think it was a rich experience for the commission, rich experience for us as facilitators, and hopefully for the community as well. I think that of the questions that have been put in the chat, that we've addressed them. I'm going to just scroll back through to see. There was a question about being a public body, meaning that the commission is a formally appointed body governed by the Open Meetings Act. And Commissioner Angel-Weirden can speak to any change in dynamics. I personally felt that it contributed to a sense of trust and transparency for the community. And it also, I think, was helpful in that everyone recognized that they were essentially, being watched in a healthy, non-surveilled way, and I think could measure their contributions in part based on the impact that those contributions would have. So in some cases, it may have stifled more robust conversation, and there were a few times when we were able to get permission to hold private listening sessions that were not streamed or televised for particular reasons. But I think that we were very conscientious about the benefits to the public of being able to see this work happen in real time, to contribute by showing up to make a comment, and to know that it was all going to be for public record. Commissioner, you're welcome to chime in though on any other ramifications of being a public body.
Yeah, I just want to be respectful of Darlene. Did she step off the call?
She did, yeah. She and Dante had to drop at the top.
Yeah, she's a lot smarter than me. So yes, I think that community accountability is critical, and one of the goals of the commission was to help build that transparency and that trust with the way the community perceives the police department. Hopefully it becomes a reality as well, and we felt that we should honor that in our own work if that was one of the outcomes that we wanted. And then secondly, I think it just added an air of professionalism to the whole process, that we're a legitimate government entity and we are accountable for those rules and accountable to our community by being publicly on the record with what we say.
And I would just add that, you know, the impact of the pandemic may yet still need to be measured as it relates to how we govern and how we make policy and how we involve the public. But speaking as the parent of 2 school-age children who live at home, the prospect of going to an in-person meeting that may be on a topic of interest to me is very slim. And it's not because I don't have the means or the interest. It's because after work hours is time that I want to spend with my family unless there's a extenuating circumstance. And so providing people with a way to engage that does not require them to physically be at the site of the meeting is something that I think has become almost an expectation, at least in some of the bigger cities. And so I just would encourage you to continue to explore that, not just a live stream of your session so that people can watch it, but a means by which they can contribute to the conversation without having to secure childcare or make a number of other arrangements that can elude many people. It's an equity measure above all else. So just for your consideration.
Wonderful. Well, I want to be respectful of our speakers' time, as well as everyone who's joined us this afternoon. You know, Larry and Steve, thank you so much for hanging on here with us a couple of minutes extra to make sure we got all of these questions addressed. I really appreciate your insight and talking about this important topic, and Steve talking about the sort of direct participation that you had, just really insightful and great takeaways from that. We are recording, and the slides as well as the recording and some of the resources that were mentioned throughout are going to be emailed to you tomorrow with the email address that you registered under. Please reach out if you have any questions for the speakers that we're not able to get addressed, and we'll make sure that we get a response to you for that. And with that, I'll hope that everyone enjoys the rest of your day, and we'll hope to see you in a future webinar. Thank you all so much.